Good afternoon, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Stacie Pettyjohn, the Director of the Defense Program at the Center for a New American Security. Joining me today at the CNAS virtual fireside chat are the Honorable John Whitley, the Acting Secretary of the Army, General James McConville, Chief of Staff of the Army, and General John Murray, the Commanding General of Army Futures Command. Secretary Generals, welcome. Thank you, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Today, we are going to discuss the Army's strategic priorities, looming hard choices related to the FY22 budget, and how the Army's modernization effort is progressing. Before we dive into that substance, however, I just want to go through a few administrative notes. This conversation is public and is being recorded. We're going to post a video of this event after it's over on the CNAS website. I'm going to reserve about 15 minutes at the end of this session for questions from the audience. If you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A function in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Please note that we're not going to be taking anonymous questions. You must identify yourself if you want me to ask it. I'm going to kick things off by posing two questions that I'm going to ask each of our guests to respond to, and then turn to a series of more directed questions. So let's get things started. We're going to start off with a tough topic, but a hugely important one. The Army, like the nation as a whole, has had a series of problems with sexual harassment and systemic racism. In response to an independent report on sexual assault, the Army recently announced that it was implementing a number of changes. More broadly, can each of you discuss how you will address the twin problems of sexual assault and racism to ensure that the Army is inclusive and diverse at all levels? Mr. Secretary, can we start with you, please?
Yes, absolutely, Stacie. And that's an excellent question. Thank you for addressing it or raising it. What I would start with was I like the way you framed the question in terms of you put racism, and I would add extremism to that in the same context as sexual assault and sexual harassment. I would also add suicide to that. Those are those three categories: suicide, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and racism and extremism are three of the biggest challenges we face. And I like combining them together because they have certain similarities and overlaps. They overlap, they're certainly not identical, but they overlap in the root causes: maladjustment, lack of cohesive teams, soldiers who aren't aligned to the mission and aren't living the Army values as a contributing factor in all of those cases. They share similarities in solutions: getting to cohesive teams, getting integrated soldiers who are part of the team, having climates where soldiers are part of the team, and if somebody is not behaving as part of the team, know what to do about that and know how to take appropriate action. So I would start off by saying these are some of the biggest challenges we face. I'm going to leave it to General McConville. I'm going to ask him to talk very specifically. He's probably our most articulate spokesman on these issues and has been probably the leader in our work efforts on these things. But we are doing a lot. We are working on unit cohesion. We're working on solutions that get at the root causes of these problems, and it's a major focus of ours.
Great, thank you. General McConville.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here with you today. And as Secretary said, these are harmful behaviors that are in our Army, they're in society, and we are committed to eliminating them from the force. And so, what do we want to do? I can tell you, as a parent of three children that serve, two sons and a daughter, I expect, and my wife demands, that we provide a safe and secure environment for our soldiers, and that's what we are doing. That's what we intend to do. And so it's really a comprehensive approach to getting after this problem set. We've stood up a People First task force with the specific intent of putting in place the right measures to make sure that we can prevent these harmful behaviors. It starts at the top. Commanders are responsible and accountable for their culture and their climate inside their units. We put in place a new command assessment program for our battalion commanders, for our brigade commanders, and soon for our sergeant majors and first sergeants. And part of that assessment will include surveys from their soldiers, from their peers, of what type of climate that they set in their unit. We're also stood up a independent review team. We call it a cohesion assessment team that goes around and can check out what type of climate and culture that we have in our units. Our Sergeant Major of the Army has stood up, This Is My Squad. And when we take a look at where these behaviors are most likely to occur, where the victims are most likely to be, that's 17 to 24-year-olds. They live in our squads. And so getting this philosophy, the philosophy of building cohesive teams where everyone treats everyone with dignity and respect, everyone takes care of each other down to the lowest level, is absolutely critical to getting after these harmful behaviors that hurt our soldiers. And quite frankly, they break trust with the American people. So we are committed to ridding our force of these harmful behaviors.
Great. General Murray.
So Stacie, I mean, I couldn't say it any better than the chief just said and the secretary before him. And, you know, as a unit commander, I think, you know, primarily our role is to help inform the chief and the secretary of what the true problems are, because sometimes I think from the top, you think you may understand what the problems. So that bottom up feed, it's important that we're getting that textured feel from young soldiers about not only what the real problems are, but the tools they need they need us to put in place to help them solve the problem. And then really, you know, once we decide a path forward and the chief and the secretary kind of slap the table and say, this is the direction we're going to go and these we're going to implement, is, as the chief said, is really driving that down to the lowest levels of an organization. And no matter what type of commander you are, because we are going to have to get this down into the ranks to solve this problem. The chief and the secretary and I talking about it today is helpful, but it's not going to solve the problem. We've got to convince our people that it's the dignity and respect piece, and that we can't afford to turn away talent, no matter where that talent lies as we move into the future.
Great. Thank you, sir. That's a very good point. You need to have the communication going up and down the chain, both ways at the same time. So we've talked about two serious issues that make the Army less ready and in turn less lethal. Apart from those that we just discussed, what is the biggest challenge facing the Army in your perspective, and what are you doing to counter it? Go back to the secretary to begin.
So, yeah, I like the way you worded that again, aside from those other two, because, you know, it's not, you can't, all of these are serious problems and serious challenges for the Army. So I don't know that you could say this one is more important than the other, but I would say the one I'd highlight here is our modernization challenge. And we've got General Murray on here, which is very appropriate. As everybody here knows, I think the Army is still operating today. We've upgraded them, but we're operating basically on 40-year-old platforms today. And we're engaged in our largest modernization effort in 40 years to bring new equipment and new capabilities into the force. We're at the very beginning stages of that. We're making tremendous progress on that, in large part, thanks to General Murray. And so if you ask me, not as the single most, but as one of multiple, some of which we've already talked about, what's one of our most important priorities today, or one of our biggest challenges today, and that is seeing this modernization agenda all the way through. We're delivering equipment into the force today. We need to continue that. We need to accelerate that, and we need to see this all the way through. And this is going to be a many-year effort.
Great. Chief, what are your views?
Well, I agree with the secretary. You know, and what I'll just take is, because I can repeat what he said, because I'm absolutely in full agreement, but just a little different approach. I think, you know, one of the things, the challenges that the secretary, myself, and the leaders have is we know we must be ready today, and we want to be ready tomorrow. And, you know, one of the ways we have to be ready today is make sure that we can maintain the all-volunteer force. That's why people are very, very important, and having organizations where everyone takes care of each other and treats each other in dignity, respect are so important. And the second piece of that is the readiness of our units today. We're in good shape readiness-wise. Over the last couple of years, we put a lot of effort into that, but we also have to be ready tomorrow. And the readiness for tomorrow is the transformation that we're undergoing, as the secretary mentioned. Every 40 years, we suggest, or we would argue, that the Army has to transform. It did in 1940, right before World War II, when General Marshall sat in my position, and he built the Army that won World War II. I would suggest that in 1980, the leaders of the Army went through a major transformation. And as the Secretary mentioned, most of the doctrine, the organizations, the training centers, and the equipment we're using is 40 years old that has been incrementally improved. And we are committed to transforming the Army without updated doctrine, organizations, training, our 6 modernization priorities, and a 21st talent management system. So we leave to our successors the Army that they need to operate in the future.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to go off script a little bit and ask you a quick follow-up since you raised readiness. We've seen a couple of the other service chiefs have made a proposal that readiness needs to be redefined from availability to deploy today to being ready for a warfight against a great power competitor. What are your thoughts on that idea?
Well, I think all the service chiefs share the same concerns. Is we don't have unconstrained resources, so it's where do you place the resources that you have? We take a look at the Army. It's, do you cut end strength, or do you leave end strength what you need today so you have the appropriate dwell time for the units that are conducting those operations? Do you spend your money to make sure that, some would say legacy or your forces that you have today are ready to go, or do you take a look at what future readiness is, which is your modernization efforts? So I think what all the service chiefs are trying to do within their areas is find that sweet spot where they have the appropriate amount of end strength and structure they need to keep a reasonable dwell time for the demand they have on their forces. None of us are going to send our troops into combat that are not ready without the proper training. That would just not be the right thing to do. And at the same time, we can't mortgage the future for today, because as we look around the world, we see a very challenging future ahead. Thank
you. General Murray, what do you see as the biggest challenge? I suspect you're going to agree with the comments of your.
Absolutely. I'd be a fool not to, but I would, what the chief said in the challenges he laid out, Stacie, I would sum it up as balance, right? And so, and what the chief said was, we don't have 2 armies. We don't have a current army. We don't have a future army. We have the current army. And really the challenge is, how do you transform that current army into that army you're envisioning into the future as part of the joint force? And that's from a technology standpoint, from a material standpoint, that's from a structure standpoint in terms of what organizational structures are going to have to change. That's from how we will fight in the future, given the technologies we're seeing today. And so how do you, over time, and on top of that, all the challenges the chief laid out in terms of op tempo and current requirements. And so how do you change that current structure, that current army, into that army you envision in the future? And there are risks along the way as you do that. Risk in terms of near-term readiness, risk in terms of far-term readiness, risk in making the wrong investments, because one thing about the future is you're almost certainly going to be wrong. But if you don't think about it, then any road will get you there, is the way I like to say it. So how do we transform that army? And then I think you asked me for one, I'll give you 2, is how do we keep pace with the rate of innovation and the rate of technological advancement, and how do we take advantage of the very innovative places around this country to help us with the problems we're trying to solve? And how do you do that within, an organization or a structure that likes to move very, very slowly and bake all the risk out of it?
Great point, sir. Those are definitely big issues. We're launching a project here at CNAS tackling that issue of defense innovation. So I agree that that's a problem. Secretary Whitley, I was going to turn back to you. We started talking about the budget. Obviously, President Biden submitted his skinny budget request a few weeks ago with a flat top line. And previously, General Milley had described the FY22 budget as going to lead to a bloodletting for the Army. Do you still expect that to be the case this year? And what are your priorities for the budget submission?
Yep.
Well, I mean, the budget's not finalized, and we're going to have to let the budget be finalized and then get released before we can talk about the particulars of it. But what I can talk about is I can talk about the Army budget in its aggregate right now, and then what some of the risks we face are. So everybody knows, I think the folks on this in this gathering are going to know the history here, that we had gotten into, and all of the department had gotten into a very serious readiness hole through the sequester years. And so we spent a period of time rebuilding readiness, the last several years, rebuilding readiness. And at the same time, we've launched what we've already talked about is the most aggressive modernization effort for the Army in 40 years. So that means what that means is, on one hand, the Army's in a very good place. The Army has rebuilt readiness, has very high positive levels of readiness today, and is at the beginning stages of what's so far been a very successful modernization program. That's the good view of the world. The other view of the world is that means there's a tremendous amount of risk in the Army's budget today for a couple of reasons. One, those readiness gains are fragile. What we learned through the sequester years is if you take your foot off the gas on readiness, it can turn around on a knife edge. It can turn around and you can lose readiness very quickly. A second thing it means is that when you look at that modernization portfolio, you look at that modernization agenda that we're undertaking right now, the Army to a large extent has self-funded it. Our budget has largely been flat for the last several years. We knew we had a modernization challenge. We knew we were going to have to take it on ourselves. So we launched what many people will be familiar with, which was our night court process, where we took money from across the Army, find lower priority programs. None of them were no priority programs. They were all valuable things that we were doing, but we found lower priority things that we were doing, and we stopped doing them. We cut programs, we rolled back programs, we scaled back programs, and we realigned that money to readiness. To modernization. So what that means now is a lot of what you might think would be excess or available resources. Well, I can shave here, I can shave there. We've done that. I think folks are pretty familiar with the numbers. $45 billion realigned in the first round of our night courts, FY 20 to 24, 10 or so billion dollars in the next round. We've done some more. It's pre-decisional, so I won't discuss it, but we've done more in the 22 cycle as well. So the first big point is, if you want to understand the Army's budget strategically, you have to understand that, one, we've rebuilt readiness. We're in a good state with readiness, but that is fragile and it could be reversed. The second is we're in a good place moving out on modernization, but that requires consistent, sustained funding to see through, to deliver products, to deliver programs, to put equipment into the hands of our soldiers. And number three, there's a tremendous amount of risk. And I think it was prudent risk. I think it was, I'm a budgeteer myself. I think we built a responsible budget, responsive to our duties and obligations to the taxpayer. But the simple fact is we took risk in the budget to get to where we are today. So there is not a lot of excess that could be used. So that's kind of an overview of the budget. So let me just talk specifically about what would happen without the resources we'd have. The first thing that would have to happen is our current op tempo would have to decline. The Army is about 25% of the department's budget. We're about 35% of the active duty end strength of the department, about 45% if you add in reserve forces. We have the largest reserve forces, but we're over 50% of the current operating tempo of the Department of Defense. We're 2/3 of the readiness demands and the readiness priorities for warfighting of the Department of Defense. The Army cannot sustain that level of commitment and operating tempo and readiness for such a wide range of things in a declining budget environment. And that's just simple math. All I'm laying out here is budget math. So I think number one, operations. I'll defer to the others to talk about specifically how we'll prioritize in modernization, specifically how we'll prioritize in readiness. The chief's been speaking very articulate about that. We're going to try to protect readiness at all costs. We're going to try to protect as much of modernization as we can at all costs. But there is not a lot of room to maneuver in the Army budget.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Chief, turning to you next, a follow on to that, operations are one of the areas that would have to be cut back if you don't receive the resources that you're requesting. One operation that has received a lot of attention, which is ending, is the one in Afghanistan. Does the impending withdrawal from Afghanistan impact the overall end strength that the Army needs?
Well, as I think you all know, the amount of troops in Afghanistan is really not a significant amount. That's out there. I think what it really comes down to, which is, as we take a look at the size of the Army right now, with a 485,000 active Army and a little over 500,000 for reserves, for a little about a million person Army. This is the same size Army that we had at 9/11. And, when I take a look at what the requirements are, when I take a look at what historically we needed, and now we're in a time of great power competition, very, very concerned about the size of the Army. Other chiefs have gone before me, and secretaries have talked about an active Army that should be over 500,000. I think the Secretary and I both agree that we can't do the things as far as readiness and when it comes to modernization. If we were to grow the Army to the level that we think would reduce the stress on deployments for our troops. So, when I take a look at it, what we're trying to do is find and produce the best Army we can with the resources that we're going to get.
Thank you, sir. General Murray, so you've talked about transforming the force so that it can conduct multi-domain operations. Last year, you held your first event in your campaign of learning called Project Convergence. Can you talk about the second iteration of this event, which I believe is scheduled for the fall, and how it has evolved? And because I'm a war gamer, I want to ask this question about Red. Right now, it seems like Project Convergence has been more of a technology demonstration. Are you envisioning transforming it into an exercise in which soldiers train against a thinking adversary?
So those are both great questions. I'm glad I got that question and not the last one, Stacie. So thank you. In Project Convergence 20, and most of your audience has probably read a little bit about it, but it was basically, to be completely honest with you, we put it together on a shoestring. And it was all about connecting sensors and shooters and seeing what we could do from a technology standpoint. A couple key missing elements from Project Convergence 20 was operational units. Because and you called it an exercise or demonstration. I prefer to call it a campaign of learning. And so, how do we go into each of the annual capstone events? Because there's actually a number of events that lead up to each Project Convergence 20 with a specific set of questions we're trying to answer, and then have data collectors on the ground, within the systems themselves collecting electronic data. And so how do we learn the most we can from each one of these? But the key thing about Project Convergence 21 is what was missing versus what we got this year. So number one is operational units. And so we'll have a division headquarters playing as part of Project Convergence 21. And that goes back to what I said earlier. It's about the technologies, and it's about the individual pieces of technologies. But what's more important is how do those individual pieces work together so that the outcome is greater than the sum of the individual parts. And so that's a key that we'll focus on this year, that operational unit. And it's also the technology, but it's also how does this fundamentally change the way we'll fight in the future? And that's where the operational unit really comes in, because I can sit back and I can imagine ways, but when you actually put technology in the hands of soldiers in the dirt and ask them to think about how this will enable them to fight differently in the future, that's an outcome we'll get in 21. And then I'd say the other key part is although we talked to the Marine Corps on the fly and got an F-35B to fly for us last year, this one is designed from the ground up to help the joint force solve joint problems. And so back in December, we formed a 3-star board of directors and included all of the services. And then we're wrapping in the Space Force now. And the Joint Staff is also part of the board of directors to build what we call use cases. So to really build the problems that we're trying to solve from a joint perspective. And there's been various articles out there, and just to lay everybody's fears, I don't want the Joint Staff J6's job. I don't want to build JADC2. But what I do think would be useful is the services informing that effort basically from in the dirt, from the ground up, as the JADC2 concept is fleshed out and built.
Great. Just one quick follow on to that. Are you planning on expanding? I know you want to bring in more of the joint force to participate. Are there any thoughts about bringing in partners and allies as well, or is that something that's a little bit farther on the horizon?
That's a great segue. So that's PC 22. And so we've already started planning Project Convergence 22. It will include the joint partners once again, because I do think that's a critical piece of it. And then I've done several sessions with the UK over the last couple of weeks. So the UK will observe in 21, participate in 22. And we've also got a commitment from the Australian Army to observe in 21 and participate in 22. And so joint and coalition. And the one thing that somebody in my headquarters said, I think it was my British LNO, said that we know we're going to fight together in the future. So we ought to be training and experimenting and learning together before that day comes. And that's really foundational what we're trying to do with Project Convergence.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I'm going to go back to the budget again a little bit and push you a little bit more on this. The skinny budget request from President Biden had emphasized the need to divest of legacy capabilities. This has been a challenge for a lot of the services on the Hill. Congress, for instance, last year reinstituted funding for Chinooks that you had tried to cut. How are you going to convince Congress of the need to retire weapons so that you can reallocate resources to modernization? And what's on the chopping block this year for the Army?
So I can't answer the last one. So just I appreciate the question, but we're still working that, and we really can't talk about that until we get to the appropriate time. But I'll come back to what we've done already, and there, on one hand, I completely agree with what you say. It's very hard, it's very challenging, and we all understand the dynamics. A bird in the hand is better than many birds in the bush. And so we want to keep lines going. We want to keep legacy systems going. But I'd also say, look at the history of our night court process. And I might have the numbers a little bit wrong, and if the numbers become important, we can correct them. But my recollection is in those first couple of rounds, I think numbers we were using at one point was we had over 180 programs had been touched. About half of those, about 90 or so of those, had been clean kills, and about 90 or so of those had been reductions. Now, some of those weren't big name signature systems. Most of those weren't big name signature systems, but there were significant buys of signature systems of the types of equipment that are out there. So what I'd say with that is what that demonstrates is that you can succeed. We did get Chinook reinstated, but that was one of the 180. So you certainly can make progress. You have to engage with Congress. Congress is very interested in modernization. Congress understands the needs of the future. Congress understands the needs to realign to near-peer competitors and what that means for the types of equipment we need to field for our soldiers. So we found that if you have the dialogue and you take the analysis over and you make the arguments, you can prevail in many of those cases. You won't prevail on 100% of the cases, but you can get some pretty good records, some pretty good scores up on the board. And I'd also defer to General McConville and General Murray, who have been in the trenches. General Murray has, every one of those programs was an argument and a discussion that he had on the Hill, and might have some insights there.
Please, if either of you want to jump in, go for it.
I guess I could just follow the secretary as far as, this is the tension that's on, every secretary, every chief, and with Mike and the Futures Command is, there's, we talk about the CH-47 Foxtrot. It's a great aircraft. It's a wonderful helicopter. And it really just comes down to, what we look at in the future and, the right time to make the decision. Do you recapitalize that aircraft as moving in the future? You're looking at future vertical lift. We have 2 aircraft that fall into that category that are going through the process right now. And I think what we're trying to do in the Army is prioritize, and, with a one to end list, so to say. And, like, as we tell industry is, one end list is what we see, but based on, cost, performance, and schedule and how those programs are coming along, that's also going to influence the decisions and recommendations we make. And I'll go over to Mike and see if he has anything else to add.
No, and Chief, the only thing I'd add is, and Stacie, I'd go back to that word balance again, right? So it's near-term risk versus long-term risk. And I think that's, the tough thing the Secretary and the Chief have to figure out, and then why I'm glad every day I'm not sitting in either one of those seats. I mean, I provide recommendations. And I would just remind you, and the word night court or deep dives have come up. So over the last 3 years, roughly 140 programs that we have stopped, and about 180 that we have slowed down in some way to pay for what we're trying to do right now. And so the Army has been very consistent for the last 3 years in terms of being committed to the 6 modernization priorities, the 31+4 signature efforts or programs that we continually talk about. And, so far we remain committed to those. And it's not because it's a 3 or 4 year old idea and we're just going to remain doggedly committed to it. Is you're a modeler and simulations, and we have done some pretty extensive modeling and simulation to really prove that those are the capabilities we're going to need in that future fight.
Great. Thanks to you all. I would just want to remind the audience that if you have questions, we've gotten some in, but please submit them now because we'll be turning to them in about 15 minutes or so. You all provided me with a very good segue to the next question that I wanted to ask, which was about the 6 modernization priorities. And I was going to start with the Chief. Fires has been listed and called out as the first among those 6 priorities, long range fires as being the #1 priority for the service right now. Are the other priorities ranked? I sort of infer that they might be when I'm reading the different documents that you've released and listening to discussions. For instance, I hear the least amount about air and missile defense. And when you couple that with the delays in fielding short-range air defenses, especially the IFPC-2 system, it suggests that might be a lesser priority than some of the other 5. Is that true? Are they ranked across the 6?
Well, I think with the way we're set up, and General Murray can kind of jump on this thing too, is I want to say they're all priorities, but we believe we need all those capabilities for the future. The long-range precision fires you hear a lot about, mainly because we go back a few years back, and the senior leadership of the Army was talking about being outgunned, outranged, and overmatched. And there was a lot of concern about that, and that kind of drove the effort. So it drove the effort at the tactical level with the extended range cannon artillery, a precision strike missile system at the operational fires side, and then the direction for us to develop hypersonics, ground-based hypersonics, and then a ground-based capability that could actually sink ships, requested by the COCOM commanders. So that's the long-range precision fires portfolio. But I would tell you, we have tremendous demand for the air and missile defense side of the house. I mean, our Patriots are really, of any force in the Army, in the highest demand. But we recognize that there's a lot of threats out there, whether it's any type of missile system that we have to contend with. And what we're really getting after is the unmanned aerial systems and the swarms, and we're developing a lot of capabilities, whether it's directed energy, high-powered microwaves, electronic attack capabilities. We're doing a lot of things, and when it comes to MSHORAD, we just sent our first platoon over to Europe, and Mike can talk a little about that. And right now, IFPC is Iron Dome is being fielded, and our soldiers are training on that. And so we are moving ahead aggressively in all these areas. And I'll turn it over to Mike for any final details on that.
Yeah, and the priority question, and I'd agree with the Chief. Fires is probably the first among equals, is the way I'd put it, because there's things that I think are 4 down on the list called the network, that none of this is possible without that robust network. So it's more what I said earlier is how do these things work together? And that was and also a thought in terms of Project Convergence 20, because we started off very simple, and it's like, how do we bring everything together to really have that synergistic effect as things work together. The air defense thing on IFPC, we were slow 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, so we've got to shoot off, I think it's this month actually, for the enduring solution for IFPC. And then I just ask you to stand by and see how quickly we can move something. Chief mentioned mobile SHORAD. That was, he mentioned the first platoon arrived in Europe, I think it was last week. That was less than 3 years from here's an idea to the first platoon delivered. Now, 3 years sounds like a long time for just one platoon, but that's, you know, if you compare the track record of how we normally do acquisitions, that's lightning fast. And I think that the one thing that really stands out in my mind about something like mobile SHORAD is we had soldiers on that platform a year ago. And so the tweaks that we made to it over the last year and the tweaks we'll make as we go forward are really the input directly from the young men and women that will be operating that system, which you would think we would have done all along, but we never did. And so really addressing the needs of our soldiers through a concept called soldier-centered design, or in commercial terms, customer-centered design, is one of the key things we're trying to do, as well as accelerate, which comes with risk. And that's that balancing of risk. If you want to move fast, there's going to be some risk. And so far, knock on wood, we've been able to work most of the risk out of these programs.
Great, thank you. Mr. Secretary, speaking about accelerated acquisition processes, it was recently announced that a contract for augmented reality headsets called IVAS was awarded to Microsoft for reportedly over $21 billion. This seems to be a big success story where you've moved from rapid prototyping to large-scale adoption very quickly. What helped this program overcome the valley of death? And can it be replicated to enable the rapid acquisition of other commercial technology?
Yeah, no, that's I think IVAS is a success story, and I'll let Mike also add to this, but I would point to a couple of points. One is the use of the new acquisition authorities. So IVAS is being done under an OTA, other transaction agreement. I think that's correct wording. And I think, and Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this will be the first major system delivered under an OTA this fast to the department along these lines of this magnitude. The second is something that Mike's already mentioned, which is the soldier touch points, and the idea of working hand in glove with a developer, in this case, Microsoft, working hand in glove with soldiers, having these regular soldier touch points, getting feedback back to the developer, and trying to use leaders in industry that they have the technology. It is us adapting the technology. It is us bringing the technology into a military application. But it's the ability. So I guess this is the third point I'm making, which is the ability to partner, in this case with Microsoft, with these cutting edge technology companies who have the technology in their companies, who have the human capital, but being able to bring it into a military context and setting. So I think some of those were the keys. I'm sure Mike can say some more articulate things and additional things.
No, Mr. Secretary, I think you covered most of the high points, and Stacie, the interactions between the engineers that were actually designing the system and, two different tracks here, the hardware track and the software track. These were all 3-week sprints. And so engineers were turning code, obviously, and software a lot faster than were turning hardware. But it was really those 3-week sprints where we were taking soldiers from really across the Army and primarily from, obviously, Joint Base Lewis McChord out in Washington, where the IVAS was being designed and built. And every 3 weeks turning that software and getting more feedback from soldiers. We're in the middle of just concluding soldier touch point number 4 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina right now, where you take an operational unit and we'll take the feedback from that and we'll determine the way forward. So it's not a lockstep, whether it's an OTA or a FAR-based contract or an MTA. I think the Secretary is right on all counts. But it's that ability to learn as you go along. And importantly, we don't have a final requirements document for IVAS. So unlike the old process where you would lock down a requirements document and then begin to develop it and discover that you can't integrate it, or the technology is not mature enough, or there's manufacturing risk, and or the standards weren't right from a technology standpoint, and you go into this long drawn out process of going back to the requirements owner to get the requirements changed and figuring things out as you're developing. Once we understand what's possible from a technology standpoint is when we'll lock the requirements document down and know what we want to look like going into final production. And then I think the other thing specifically with IVAS is, so we have in my opinion, we have a pretty limited idea what IVAS could do for us right now. But you can imagine, if you augmented reality, virtual reality, you can imagine soldiers sitting in back of a combat vehicle, and it's like the armor is not even there. It's just some cameras on the outside of the vehicle to allow that to happen. And so I think there's all kinds of potential in terms of IVAS specifically that we haven't even begun to scratch the potential yet.
Let me just elaborate very briefly on a point that Mike made. And one of the phrases I've learned from him is going to industry with problems, not requirements. And I think that's what he was describing just a minute ago. And an approach that we've been using has been very effective.
Thanks to you all. That's really interesting. So I have two quick questions on long range fires that I want to pose to the Chief and General Murray before we hop into Q&A from the audience, because questions are starting to pile up. So the first one I was going to ask General McConville, what attributes distinguish ground-based missiles from other standoff weapons in the Indo-Pacific warfight? And what missions would you expect them to be undertaking? And how does this support the joint force?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of discussion. I've seen some of the discussion going on. We look at, long range precision fires. Do they come from the air? Do they come from the sea? Or in this case, we give the option to the combatant commander, which they have requested that they come from the land. And, when I look at, what would these systems do? Well, first of all, it's an option for the combatant commander, but it's also a dilemma for our competitors, or in some cases in the realm of deterrence, but also for adversaries. They can't protect anywhere. They can't protect everywhere. And they have to decide that, if they're going to focus on countering systems, just like we all do, much, much better to have, a primary and alternate contingency and present them with multiple dilemmas when it comes to. So what can they do? They can, in some ways, do our own anti-access area denial capability in some of the places that we want to protect. They can do counterfire at a much longer range. If you think about it, if someone wants to shoot something at us, rather than us just shooting it down with our Patriot missile systems, or THAAD, or some other system, that we can respond in kind, and that all of a sudden changes the calculus on what they might do. These systems can be used to suppress air defense. We do that routinely at the Army level, where we use ATACMs, or we use MRS to suppress air defense for attack helicopters that go, in our eyes, deep. It's certainly not deep in the concept of strategic depth, so that they can also do that. And so there's a lot of capability that they can provide. And there's a lot of discussion of, well, in order to have land-based systems, you have to have an authority to use that land base, and that'll be decided by policymakers and work out those type options. And as we've looked at history, we've gone to countries, or operated with countries that we never thought we would operate from or with, and that really depends on the situation and the interests of that country and our country. So again, we were following the COCOM's request in the direction of OSD, and I think that the secretary, from where he sits, can give a little better perspective on that, because he was actually at Cape when a lot of this analysis was going on.
Sure.
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to. My prior job, prior to being the acting secretary of the Army, was I was the acting Cape director for the last half of 19 or so, the first half of 20. So I have seen some of the discussion about how did we get to the allocation and the plan, the portfolio plan that we have for long range fires, and really that grew out of what was a strategic portfolio review led by Kate in the late early 2020 timeframe. It was a very high priority. It's been a very high priority for a period of time. At that point in time, Mike Griffin was the Undersecretary for R&D. And he was very articulate and knowledgeable about what our adversaries were doing and what the needs were. So Kate did do a strategic portfolio review in that time, and that's really where the current kind of portfolio across the department in terms of what the Army's doing, what the Navy's doing, what the Air Force is doing came out of, and that was the department's position. A couple of things that affected the Army out of that was the acceleration and actually growth of the long range hypersonic weapons, and that was where the FY23 fielding date. I think we've been I might have the facts a little bit misremembering, but I think we've been planning a fielding date a little bit later than that, and it was that study that led us to pull that forward to 223. And that also brought up some of the mid-range capabilities and some of the mid-range requirements that the Army's now working towards came out of that study. So I just offer that. That was, I know there's been some question about what was the history of how the department's position evolved and where did it come from? And that is some of that history.
That's really useful context. Thank you. General Murray, I had one question drill down on this for you about long-range fires. The Indo-PACOM commander, the former Indo-PACOM commander, had made ground-based fires a key part of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative request to Congress this year. And the Army had announced that your mid-range capability is going to consist of 2 U.S. Navy systems that already exist, the SM-6 and the Tomahawk, which should expedite the fielding of them. So I was wondering if you could speak to how quickly you thought you could actually make these systems operational and whether you would need to create new units and expand the size of the force to do so.
Well, I'll take the second part first, and obviously we don't have any of those units in the Army right now. So I mean it's a different process than what I'm part of it, but I don't own it. But the chief really makes those final decisions in terms of what the structure looks like. So yes, there will have to be some new units created, and it's more of a conversion at this point. I think the decision is than a brand new unit. So we'll convert existing units to take on this new mission. Trying to, off the top of my head, remember the exact year, but I believe, and I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb here, I think it's 23 is when we deliver the first battery. And, why can we move that fast? One of the reasons is, we've given this to Lieutenant General Neil Thorogood to kind of bring to fruition down at what we call our Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technologies Office. And Neil's a 3-star general. He's a former program manager, former program executive officer, so he knows how to get these things done. And probably the key thing is, and one of the things that I think is a viable way forward is you talk about duplication. So we also don't need to be duplicating S&T and research and development investments and development. Right. So if the system is out there that we can rapidly get into the hands of our soldiers to create that capability the combatant commander has asked for, as you mentioned, then why wouldn't we take advantage of that capability? Are there other options when you get a little bit further out? There are, but this is just another way of moving quickly to get capability into the hands of our soldiers to meet the combatant commander's needs.
Great, thank you. So we have a bunch of questions. I'm going to group 2 together, one from Will and one from Douglas, and they're both inquiring about capabilities or sort of skills that aren't as relevant for China war fight. Will was questioning about whether the Army is going to try to retain any counterinsurgency capability, while Douglas was asking whether the Army is intending to follow the example of the Marine Corps and divest of some of its armor. So anyone feel like
let me just start off at the high policy level and then turn it over to the chief to answer from a military and operational perspective. So first off, counterterrorism, countering violent extremist organizations, that's still in the NDS. And as much as, it'd be nice, nobody would love more than the Army for that problem set to go away. But the problem set's not going away. So no, we will be engaged for the foreseeable future in that mission space. It is part of the NDS, and it's just the reality of the world that we live in. We'll work that a lot with special operations, of course, but that issue is not going away. And what was the second one again? I'm sorry.
Armor and whether the Army had plans to divest.
Well, this gets back to the broader strategic questions the department faces. So a couple of points, and I'm going to turn it over. The chief has spoken on this specific issue as well. But the first is we do have to be prepared for the entire set of problems that the U.S. faces, and so we're the Pacific, and China is the pacing threat. We also have to deal with Europe. We also have to deal with other parts of the world as well. So certainly there has been no removal of all armored forces from our O plans. So the Army is going to respond to the requirements we're given, and we're going to have armored forces. They're going to be necessary in Europe, and they will be necessary that there will be urban warfare. Just to give one example of where armor becomes incredibly valuable, there will be urban warfare probably, unfortunately, in any of the scenarios we think about, even in the Pacific, even in the Europe, even in other places as well. So I'll turn it over to the chief to give more specific answers. But I think from a policy perspective, nobody would like to give up missions more than the Army. We seem to carry our share of missions around in our back pocket, but we live in the real world, and we have to respond to the requirements we're given from the combatant commanders and the Joint Staff.
No, I just got to kind of take over for where the secretary talked about on. I'll start with counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, operation, regular warfare. That is not going away. In fact, as we look around the world, there's many places that could be incubators for potential terrorism, and so we are structured, and we've actually developed new organizations to assist with capacity and capability building. That's the Security Force Assistance Brigades. We have the best special forces in the world, and they've been doing that for 20 years. And so we continue to see them with their regional orientation, working with forces and helping develop forces within various countries that can do counterterrorism, that can do counterinsurgency. And then as we work in the competition phase, building the capacity and capability of our allies and partners is going to be an extremely important job of what we're doing. And as the secretary said, those violent extremists have not gone away. In some cases, they may be more in some of the countries. So that is not going away. As General Murray said, we don't know what the future is exactly going to be right, but I can almost guarantee you there's going to be some type of violent extremist threat out there that we're going to have to deal with, and we're going to have to keep those skill sets that we've developed over the last 20 years. On the armor side, I often hear that as you need to get rid of, armor. We don't need tanks anymore. And again, I'm an aviator, but I did have tanks in a brigade that was involved, and I got to see the 1st Cavalry Division fight in Iraq and fight in Sardis City and fight with the Marine Corps. Fight along with the Marine Corps, not with the Marine Corps, along with the Marine Corps in Fallujah, and fight along with the Marine Corps in the Najaf. And, we quickly learned that you really want some type of armor capability, especially in the cities. We saw what happened in Sardis City when we originally went in there with Humvees, and that was not a good situation. I could look at Mogadishu in Somalia. If they had maybe a small amount of armed forces, that might have changed that whole battle. So I would suggest that those who say get rid of armor, I would just not do that very quickly. And then we haven't even talked about Europe and the importance there. But the other thing is, and Mike can talk a little about this, and as we take a look at the future of armed forces, we're always concerned about weight. As we start getting more sophisticated when it comes to technology with active protective systems, both for ground launched and countering unmanned aerial systems, we're going to take advantage of that technology and make sure that our systems have the best protection for our soldiers. So I don't see that going away. And Mike, do you want to add to that?
The only thing that I'd add, Chief, is, and this was said well before I said it, is, when we look at possible places we might be fighting in the future, I mean, we've done that before and we've been wrong every single time. And so I think it's dangerous to assume that there's only one fight remaining out there, and designing any service or the joint force for only one specific area, because I think that just emboldens other potential adversaries when you do that, whether that's counterinsurgency or whether that's other theaters we might be looking at. And there are promises in technology out there that we're experimenting with. Lightweight materials, Chief mentioned vehicle protective systems. And then can you even get away from protecting individual vehicles to protecting formations? And, how do you defend against 100 drones in a swarm that are a mesh network and semi-autonomous, or maybe even completely autonomous? And so I think there's challenges out there that technology can help us solve. But the one asymmetric advantage I think we'll always have, Stacie, is we'll always be part of a joint force. We'll always fight with coalition and partners. And I do think that we have the best soldiers in the world. And I think that will also always be one of our asymmetric advantages wherever we fight.
And I just wrap up what all three of us said, Stacie. I'll just be very brief, but just to say, we respond to requirements, right? I mean, the Army, there are many missions the Army would like to unilaterally divest. We're not allowed to, right? We have to say, there's armor in the plans. We have to be able to deliver against the plans. There's CVEO in the demand signal. We have to be able to deliver CVEO. So there's many things we'd like to divest, but we ultimately are responsive to the requirements placed on us by our combatant commanders and the Joint Staff.
Absolutely. So I have a question from Mila for General Murray about the Army Software Factory and what the primary problems that it is focused on right now, and how you expect that it's going to contribute to the Army's digital transformation over the next few years.
Yep. So that's I'm glad we went there. I was looking for an opportunity to talk about software factory. It's actually an amazing story. And it was a lesson coming out of Project Convergence 20. And at Project Convergence 20, we didn't have a thing we now have called the Joint Systems Integration Lab. So we basically spent the first 6 weeks at 120 degrees in Yuma, Arizona, coding and recoding just to make things work together. And it was a blinding flash of the obvious that, if you look at what I think a future battlefield could look like, we're going to have the ability to code at the tactical edge. So units that are in contact are going to have young people able to rewrite code to solve commanders' problems almost at a moment's notice. And so normally the way we would do that is we would go out and we'd hire contractors. And so the vision is that we're going to find the talent in the Army that can do this for us in tactical units, write code, solve commanders' problems, and we're going to build a capability to self-generate that talent. So for soldiers, by soldiers. We're at the first step of that right now. I was told when we started this, you're going to have to go out and find people, hire people that have that coding ability. I would just tell you, we hung a simple advertisement on our website saying, if you can code, we're interested. If you can code and you're wearing a uniform, we're interested. Within 2 weeks, we had 2,000 kids that were completely qualified to do this. We down selected the 24. 11 of the 24 were on their way out of the United States Army because we weren't fully utilizing their talent. And so we'll roll in cohort 2 in July, cohort 3. And so over time, working our way into where we actually have uniformed soldiers and DA civilians in this next cohort. They're able to do this for the Army without reliance. It's not about IP that belongs to different companies. It's about the ability to write the code at the edge we need to enable commanders.
Thank you, sir. So I'm mindful that we have run out of time, so I apologize to the audience for the questions that we didn't get to. We ended up having a very rich discussion here, and I'd like to thank our guests, with Secretary Whitley, Generals McConville, and Murray, for joining me today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for having